Well, welcome to our today IIEA webinar, which is about sanctions and human rights. My name is Mohammad Farzanegan from IIEA University of Marburg, and we have the pleasure of having Dr. Peksen today, Dursun Peksen, who is going to present one of his ongoing research on the effects of imposition and lifting of sanctions and human rights situation in the target countries. So we would have almost 30 minutes presentation by Dr. Peksen, which will follow by question and answer for about 30 minutes. And please use the question and answer box in the Zoom for your questions, which we come to that at the end of the presentation of Dursun. So let me first to introduce briefly Dr. Peksen, who is going to talk about his research on sanctioning human rights. Dr. Peksen is the first Horizon University professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Memphis. He's an expert in economic sanctions, armed interventions, human rights, political violence, and democratization. He has published extensively in a variety of international journals, including Journal of Politics, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and Comparative Political Studies. So the topic of sanctions has become quite popular over the past years, as we see it's more and more applications in international conflict resolutions. And there have been many purposes of imposition of sanctions on target countries. Among many purposes, of course, it has been said that the sanctions are used to improve human rights in the target countries, democratization, things like this. Although that majority of our attention as economists have been on quantifying the economic cost of sanctions, but it's equally important to find out whether sanctions have been effective to improve the human rights, and if yes, through which mechanisms, and whether the sanctions at the end have not been effective to enhance the situation of human rights in the target countries, and all the debates regarding these issues. So today we are trying to basically talk about these aspects which have been rather under-examined in the economic literature on the sanctions, and we hope to open a discussion on that and continue talking about these important topics in the effects of sanctions. So we'll stop here and give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Peksen, to offer his insights, and thanks him again for joining us today in IIEA webinar to share his findings on the topic of sanctioned human rights. Thank you very much, and please, Dr. Peksen.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Mohammed. Hello, everyone. My name is Dursun Peksen. Mohammed had already that very nice introduction. So I am presenting today a work in progress. It is a working paper, and I very much look forward to your feedback. So what I want to do, this is a paper that we recently started working on, and it's a co-authored paper. I would like to recognize my co-author, Jin Young. I am working on this paper with Jin, and in this paper, what we want to do is that we want to look at to what extent human rights conditions change during after sanctions are lifted. In other words, we are interested in the question of to what extent human rights political repression committed by repressive leaders increase or decrease following the termination of sanctions they are facing from external actors. So let me just very briefly give you an outline of my presentation. I'll do my best and keep it under 30 minutes, my presentation, so that we will have enough time for the Q&A. So I want to very briefly, after posing my research question, I am going to very briefly review the existing literature on the consequence of sanctions, right? And then I will very briefly talk about the relationship between sanctions and repression or human rights during the sanctions years. And after that, I will talk about our focus on the human rights effects following the lifting of sanctions. I will briefly talk about my data and methodological approach and report the findings, and then I will just draw a few conclusions based on what we studied. Very quickly, once again, our big research question, right? Our research question in this study is, does the lifting of human rights sanctions help or hurt citizens facing repression from the sanction leaders? In other words, do human rights sanctions get better or worse when sanctions are lifted, right? I am assuming everyone in the audience know what I mean by sanctions. I am mostly looking at government mandated trade and financial restrictions. When I refer to human rights, I am mostly talking about political repression or respect for basic political rights and liberties in sanctioned countries. I just want to make sure we are all on the same page when it comes to my two key terms, sanctions and human rights. So what do we know about the consequence of sanctions? Like as Mohammad noted, sanctions have become the sort of the go-to instruments. They are quite popular, right? Even some scholars call the post-Cold War era, like in the 1990s, as the sanctions decade. Sanctions have just basically replaced alternative coercive tools, particularly military interventions, right? Early research mostly focused on the question of, do sanctions work, right? Do they achieve their intended policy objectives? We know from the literature that sanctions are more likely to fail than succeed in achieving their intended policy objectives, right? So there are existing data sets suggest that sanctions work about 30%, 35% of the time in attaining their stated policy objectives, right? In the 1990s, right, the literature sort of shifted from the effectiveness question to the consequence of sanctions, right? If you recall the sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s, right, we observed sort of like some significant humanitarian suffering, like humanitarian damage caused by comprehensive sanctions initiated under the auspices of the United Nations. So a new strand of literature looked at not the effectiveness question, but how exactly socioeconomic and political conditions in general change in target countries following the imposition of sanctions. That is the consequence of sanctions, right? This line of research, which is where our paper also fits in, talks about finds significant evidence that sanctions could sort of trigger more violent and non-violent repressive means by the targeted governments. Studies show that sanctions are likely to undermine humanitarian conditions, right? There are multiple studies showing that public health conditions are likely to get worse during the sanctions years, and also there are studies published by political economists that sanctions not only undermine economic growth and productivity, but also could lead to more dire conditions for average citizens in the form of more poverty and income inequality, right? So my work and others also show that sanctions do probably more harm than good and could have these adverse effects. But what's interesting is that sort of we need to keep in mind that marginalized groups tend to suffer more from sanctions than sort of political elites and their ruling coalition. So what we see is that groups like women or minority groups are tend to bear disproportionately bear the burden of sanctions, right? So in other words, sanctions have these well reported and well studied sort of consequences, right? What this study is do here is that I would like to note that most of this literature looks at human consequences during the sanctions years, right? They do not necessarily pay attention to what happened after sanctions are lifted. That's the post-sanctions period is very understudied area of research. That's where we would like to focus on. Before I talk about what happens human rights during the post-sanctions period, I would like to begin with what happens exactly when sanctions are imposed. Do human rights conditions get better or worse during the years sanctions are in place, which is one of the probably the most widely actual studies, widely studied topics in the literature. Let me just very briefly tell you what happens when sanctions are imposed, right? Existing studies suggest that, right, sanctions are likely to undermine human rights conditions. In other words, sanctions might lead to more repression by targeted governments, right? We have, I can think of 5 or 6 different studies. I'm just that looked at different sort of causal mechanisms to make sense of this idea that maybe sanctions could do more harm than good in terms of human rights conditions. They tell us that, right, when sanctions are imposed, right, though sanctioning entities might expect target governments to give in this pressure, we see the opposite, right? Sanctions actually might create more incentives for sanctioned leaders to commit repression, right? What happens is that sanctions could result in some more political instability in society, right? So, and the target leaders often respond to these growing grievances, violence with more repression, right? The other causal mechanism that sort of explains the surprising finding that sanctions might actually backfire and might be counterproductive and thus cause more repression is the idea of consolidation of coercive powers. As opposed to the idea that sanctions will hurt target governments and they will give in to pressure, what we see is that sanctions actually rarely harm the coercive capacity of target governments, right? Because target governments have the control over the scarce public resources. What happens is that they oftentimes disproportionately use these resources to remain to keep their coercive power intact, while everyday citizens are significantly suffering from these sanctions, right? So what we see is that in most repressive, in most cases, sanctions cases, targeting repressive regimes, think about Cuba, Iran is probably another good example, North Korea and others, leaders remain in power because they know how to use the remaining scarce resources at the expense of everyday citizens. Hence, they will have enough power to commit repression even during the sanctions years, right? The other thing that studies find is that drawing from this principal agent theory, oftentimes when leaders face sanctions, they are likely to sort of dismiss some of their domestic responsibilities, such as keeping the bureaucracy in check, right? So we see a spike in the extent of poor governance in target governments where human rights violations are much more likely to occur. So the overall, I know this is a very detailed literature, but what we find is that sort of sanctions are likely to lead to adverse human rights conditions during the sanctions years, right? This is where we know from the literature. What we want to do is that take a step forward and look at what happens when these sanctions episodes end, right? When sanctioning countries, right? Say the United States, United Nations, EU, and others, when they decide to eventually lift these sanctions, do these worsening human rights conditions continue, or do we observe some changes, right? So what we want is that we have one sort of we have this one broad theoretical sort of framework. We begin with a sort of a broad theoretical framework, right? That suggests that we expect human rights conditions are likely to deteriorate, get worse, even during the post-sanctions years. If a given sanctions regime is lifted, terminated, we expect that the human rights conditions can get worse in those countries, right? We think there are sort of 2 major reasons in broader terms. First and foremost, right, if a repressive leader sort of faces no longer the pressure of sanctions, right, there is no external pressure, right, then they have no incentive to sort of comply with human rights, right? What they might do, that they might continue to go after the opposition and human rights groups, and hence continue to repress them, right? Because the lifting of sanctions might even embolden them more to commit repression. So the reduced external pressure might help them or might encourage them, might induce them to commit more repression. We also expect that reduce internal pressure, right? The idea here is that not only the lifting of sanctions may indicate there is no more external sort of pressure on these repressive leaders, but there is also, most of the time, these opposition groups and human rights advocacy networks mobilize during the sanctions years to pressure target governments, right? If sanctions are lifted, they may also feel left alone and have less incentive to mobilize. In other words, the lifting of sanctions itself can weaken the opposition, which will embolden the target government to even commit more repression. So our first general hypothesis is that sanctions in general, especially human rights sanctions, I should say, right? I should make this clear that we are mostly interested in sanctions that are imposed with the specific purpose of human rights. When human rights sanctions are terminated, we expect to find that human rights conditions, right, are likely to worsen. In other words, the extent of repression in target governments might increase or will increase following the termination of human rights sanctions. Just to make sure we are all on the same page, what I mean by the termination is that when the sender and sanctioning and target governments agree on certain terms to remove the sanctions, and when those sanctions are publicly removed, right, those trade and financial restrictions, that's what we mean by that period where sanctions are removed is the termination of sanctions for us, right? So overall, we expect, once again, that human rights conditions are likely to get worse during the post-sanctions period, okay? But this is just a very broad hypothesis, right? But we want to do more than this, right? We also think that, right, the impact of sanctions, right, particularly human rights sanctions in the post-sanctions era might be conditioned by the outcome of sanctions, right? The idea here is that, yes, sanctions are lifted, but we know we need to pay attention to whether or not those lifted sanctions were successful or failed sanctions, right? Failed sanctions are the ones where sender countries do not achieve their intended policy objectives, right? If they remove sanctions, despite the ongoing repression in target governments, we call them as failed sanctions, right? One just example just comes to mind is that if you recall, last year, for instance, some of these oil sanctions against the Maduro regime were eased, or at least some of them were removed, right? Those sanctions were in place because of the Maduro regime in Venezuela was committing repression against opposition, right? Those sanctions were lifted by the Biden administration around the elections time, because and thus those kind of cases are considered failed human rights cases, right? Sanctions cases, right? We think that in the case of failed human rights sanctions, right, the sanctions that were initially imposed with the purpose of forcing target governments to undertake necessary reforms, human rights reforms, if they fail, we think that target governments in those cases, right, here we are again looking at the outcome of those terminated sanctions. In those cases, we think that target governments might not feel any additional incentive to repress, right? They were already repressing the opposition and their rivals during the sanctions years. Sanctions were removed without altering their repressive behavior. And thus, if human rights sanctions were failed in terms of their outcome, we think that in the post-sanctions period, right, the extent of repression is unlikely to change, right? No additional incentive for target governments. They already proved their audience that they were able to withstand the external pressure, and they have no more reason to increase their repression. We are not suggesting here that they might not continue to repress. we are saying that in the post-human rights sanctions area, if those human rights sanctions fail, we don't expect to see a significant increase following the removal of those sanctions, right? What happens in the cases where human rights sanctions actually succeed, right? So there are a lot of targeted governments who commit like repression, think about imprisoning their political rivals, committing torture, committing extrajudicial killings. When they face sanctions, right, it could be aid cuts, it could be restrictions on the banking industry and other sort of form of sanctions. Sometimes, right, in some cases, of course, sanctions work, right? Human rights sanctions may force target governments to alter their repressive practices during the sanctions years, right? These are, once again, successful human rights sanctions. If a repressive leader agrees to change its behavior in response to those sanctions, right, we call them as successful human rights sanctions. In those cases, we think that there are sort of two possible outcomes, right? The most obvious one is that if those sanctions worked and if target government agrees to change their repressive behavior in exchange for the lifting of sanctions, we could just see that they could be sincere human rights reformers. And thus, they might just continue to sort of respect human rights and seek to improve their human rights conditions following those successful sanctions, right? We call this our hypothesis 3A, sort of, in other words, one possible outcome of successful human rights sanctions could be that those successful sanctions could continue to help human rights following the removal of sanctions. But we also think that there's an alternative theoretical expectation here, right? Maybe most of those repressive leaders, when they agree to, right, reduce their repressive practices in return for the lifting of sanctions, maybe once those successful sanctions are lifted, they may no longer have enough incentives to commit, to stick with improving human rights conditions, right? So there is a very established body of literature, especially in the human rights literature, right? In human rights literature that suggests that, right? We observe oftentimes this decoupling effect, right? Leaders, when they face external repression, they will agree to undertake reforms for window dressing purposes. But once that external pressure is gone, they may go back to their practices of repressing people, right? In other words, their sincere commitment to human rights might be until the sanctions are removed. But once that external pressure is gone, what we might see is that they may go back to their regular repressive behavior. That is to say that an alternative way that human rights sanctions may affect repressive behavior in the post-sanctions area could be the opposite of our first hypothesis. Again, 3A told us that repression will decline. Maybe it will be the opposite, right? That the extent of repression might go up once successful sanctions that really force initially target governments to change their behavior are removed. So these are our hypotheses. Once again, we are looking at post-human rights sanctions era. We do run a sort of time series cross-sectional analysis to test our three hypotheses on the post-human rights effects of sanctions. So we use the global sanctions database for sanctions. We have a data from 1975 until 2020. We are looking at over 30 years of data, or 40 years of data. So we coded these dichotomous variables, human rights sanctions and non-human rights sanctions. These are variables indicating whether or not a given country is under an ongoing human rights sanctions, right? And then we coded to test our first hypothesis on the removal of sanctions. We coded a sanctions variable that indicates when exactly human rights sanctions were removed. We also, given that we are also interested in the outcome of those terminated sanctions, we also have separate variables that tells that indicates the end of successful and the end of failed human rights sanctions. These are our dichotomous human rights variables. We have a continuous human rights variable that looks at the extent of respect for basic rights and freedoms in a given country. And we run an error correction model. Of course, the biggest, from a statistical standpoint, the biggest challenge is the selection effects, right? The governments, the countries that we are dealing with are also the ones that already have poor human rights conditions. To be able to sort of address the selection effects and reverse causality, we run an error correction model with first difference dependent variable as well as the first difference independent variables as on the right hand side of our equation, right? Very quickly, let me report our findings. I hope you can all see that. So what we find is that, once again, these are all the sanctions. These are the sanctions variables in our model. We have also a lot of control variables. This is a multivariate analysis, but to make the table easier to read, in these error correction models, what we find is that if you could look at the first model, what we see is that sanctions, like the ongoing sanctions, are likely to deteriorate human rights, right, which is the finding in the literature. What we see is that when those human rights sanctions are lifted, right, we are likely to see a spike in the extent of repression in line with our first hypothesis. If you wonder, if we do control for non-human rights sanctions imposed with the purposes other than human rights, it could be over, I don't know, a trade dispute or terrorism. In those cases, we see no significant statistical association. In model 2, that's where I think our most novel finding is, where we look at the differences between successfully ended sanctions versus sanctions that ended with a failure. What we see is that the negative effect that we found in model 1 for the human rights lifting variable is mostly driven by the successful human rights sanctions. The findings here suggest that target governments may agree to improve human rights in return for the removal, and they may undertake some reforms during the sanctions to be able to get rid of the sanctions. But once those sanctions are lifted, what we see an increase in the extent of repression in the years following the sanctions, right? So we also have this long-run multiplier. So we also looked at how much this negative effect of successful human rights sanctions sort of last and change over time. We find that, right, the suggested adverse human rights effect of successful sanctions is larger in the earlier rather than later years of sanctions. That is to say that we see that the sanctions are likely to have this lasting long-term negative effect, particularly successful sanctions, but the impact will be felt more in the earlier rather than later years of sanctions. Well, I have 2 more minutes. Let me just very quickly sort of summarize what exactly we find and what we think this findings suggest. First and foremost, we suggest that, right, it is the existing literature has done significant work in terms of what happens during sanctions years. We moved beyond that literature and look at the post-sanctions period. In the case of human rights, what we find is that human rights conditions are unlikely to get better once sanctions are lifted in both the cases of failed and successful sanctions. So, the assumption is that sanctions work, and these target governments, release political prisoners, or they might take some other political reforms for the sake of getting the sanctions lifted. But what happens is that we are unlikely to see that, good behavior will continue once sanctions are lifted. And especially in the case of successful human rights sanctions, we suggest that, there won't be any lasting positive effects. Successful human rights sanctions are good in eliciting this behavioral change from target governments. Once they are removed, what we see, we assume, and what we find is that actually human rights abuses might come back, might even go up after those successful sanctions are lifted. I think I was able to finish right in 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peksen, for this informative presentation about the effects of sanctioning human rights. So we have the opportunity for question and answer. So please, if the participants have a specific question with respect to the presentation, use the question and answer box to ask their questions. So we can also invite you to present your questions on your own. So so maybe I start, Dr. Peksen, with asking you the question with respect to the real examples. Are you aware about any specific country on the sanctions which the sanction imposed due to the humanitarian purposes, and that resulted to improvement of human rights during the sanctions, which then ending of the sanctions related to human rights return back the country to the situation before imposition of that. So to have some tangible examples, if this case that you are predicting, explaining here has been also happened. Are you aware about any specific case which went through this experience?
Yes. Should I just, do you want to take all the questions first, or you want me to answer one?
Oh, well, I'm waiting for the questions of our audience to come, but maybe as a opening.
Okay, so yeah, once again, this is work in progress. I think this is an excellent question, right? Thanks for asking it. So how do we substantiate these findings? So how do we make sense of the sanctions in real cases? We actually have at least 9 cases, right? Once again, this is work in progress. Hopefully, when this one day, if we can go through this mean review process, how challenging that process could be. Once we successfully publish this is a very early version of our paper. So we want to bring in cases. The ones that we were thinking to look at, like the Rwanda in the 1990s. So actually, even when you look at the raw data, we found that there was actually, sometimes leaders will, of course, the literature suggests that sanctions in general are detrimental to human rights during sanctions years. That's probably, Mohammad, the majority of the cases. But there are also quite a few, like we could count at least 9 specific cases where sanctions work initially, right? Repressively. Rwanda is a case, Lesotho was another one, Turkmenistan was another one. Initially, they will sort of change their human rights practices, right? Sort of and then what happens is that in those cases, we see once sanctions are lifted, repressive regimes might go back to what they do best, their people. Sort of so we have several cases from Africa as well. Kenya is another one. Rwanda, I think Turkmenistan. It's not in this version of the paper. That's why I'm actually glad you asked it. It just tells me that you might be able to do a better job in terms of incorporating those cases. But yeah, we are aware of it. But in the next iteration of this paper, we will sort of provide some specific examples.
Because I'm asking this question because I'm still waiting for question of audience, so I hope that we would have more questions. The point is, when a country is under sanctions, so we are observing the worsening of economic condition, the welfare. We had the evidence that the middle class becomes weaker, and all these elements within a society which might make the state accountable for respect of human rights and implementation of reforms, and so becomes weaker. So right. So in that sense, to me, as a observer of the sanction, for example, in case of Iran, of course, there are many other countries under sanction, but I guess the example of Iran is quite prominent, the most sanctioned country after Russia recently. we observe that the society becomes on average poorer, and we are observing a weakening middle class, in which is the engine of the driver of all these reforms, right? And then, of course, we expect when the sanctions are lifted, now it is human rights sanction or economic sanction, trade sanction, whatever sanctions are lifted. So we are observing an improvement in the economic status of these segments of societies. And once again, we are observing a stronger civil society, right? And then that is something which, promote more reforms and more basically desire for democratization, more political participation, civil society, and so on and so forth. But your results basically showing the opposite of these, right?
Yeah.
So you argue that whether imposition of human rights related sanction or lifting of them, it seems that they are basically not effective to improve the human rights, and by opposite, they are even worsening the situation. So this is what the results up to now are showing, and that highlights or brings a question of mechanism, how, to which mechanism these worsening situations are manifesting itself. So maybe that would be an extension of your research, I guess, that is still not reflected maybe in this stage of your analysis, but I guess it is equally important to look at that.
So very quickly, Mohammed, I think sort of like, let's keep in mind that when like these leaders face external pressure, we are not talking about some type of bottom-up movement that forces them to reform, right? It's like a top-down approach in the sense that even if the middle class is weakening or public are suffering, target leaders are not responding to the general public. They are responding to the external pressure. Their incentive is to find a way to remove those, get those sanctions removed. That's why their willingness to undertake reforms might be in response to the pressure they are facing, not necessarily what is happening in society, right? I think there's bottom-up versus top-down mechanisms that I think we could just elaborate more on in the paper.
Right. I have two questions, quick Q&A by now, so I go over them. So Marzieh is asking, what were your case studies? Did you have also case studies beyond these cross-country time series in your analysis?
Yeah, this is a global cross-national analysis, and again, it's a work in progress. So what we want to do in the next iteration is to provide specific cases. The ones that we have in mind so far are Rwanda. We found some evidence in the case of Kenya and others. So yes, we will. It's mostly statistical for now because it's the first stage of this project. But in the next stage, I think there are quite a few cases, right, that we find that leaders are not sincere reformers, right? Once sanctions are lifted, right, they are likely to, they might continue to have this repressive behavior. In successful cases, they might even increase the extent of repression to be able to control the general public in check.
Thank you. Said Moshiri is asking how basically the successful and failed sanctions are defined in your analysis. Are they based on the human rights outcomes, or what was that?
Thank you so much. Yes, that's so we do sort of, there's a standard way of measuring and quantifying success and failure in the sanctions literature. So we just basically, we did not code the data ourselves. This comes from the GSDP. Successful cases are where target governments agree to change their human rights practices in return for the lifting of sanctions. In other words, they come to the table and negotiate. They tell, look, I will stop committing extrajudicial killing. I will stop prisoning my opposition. I will stop sort of committing torture, right? So what happens is that if the sender countries sort of agree with if the target governments agree to terms that senders have in terms of human rights reforms, those kind of sanctions are considered successful cases. Failed ones, the ones that are lifted without eliciting, without getting any sort of type of behavioral change from target governments. This is the idea behind success and failure. I would like to note that success and failure looks at based on what happens during the sanctions years, right? If target agrees to change their behavior, then sender lifts it. That will be a successful cases. If there was no change in target behavior and the sender still decides to get rid of them, like the oil sanctions in the case of Venezuela last year, those are failed cases, right? Because the Maduro regime is still in power and they haven't really improved their human rights conditions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a question from Behname Atal. He's asking and wondering, there are many countries in the world which they are not under the sanctions. My question is how we can see different layers of human rights and how can we and how can determine which countries are more vulnerable in terms of human rights, for example, Middle Eastern countries, and what are the relationship of human rights and immigrants. So
So the is the question, let me is it written, yeah, is the question is which countries are more likely to respond to external pressure?
that maybe if basically you have also target countries that is hosting a significant number of immigrants, like in, for example, in Iran. So it is hosting a large group of Afghans, refugees and immigrants. And whether that composition in population or the share of migrants or refugees might also
Yes.
determine the outcome.
Okay, so which countries are more vulnerable in terms of human rights? I think that's the part. I think sort of when there's that selection effects, right? Sometimes if the country is very heavily dependent on external aid, right? They might, like, if they have significant external dependence on like the US and other countries in terms of foreign aid and other forms, those could be the type of countries that might be more responsive to sanctions, right? The literature finds that the sanctions are much more likely to work in general in achieving their stated objectives if they inflict significant damage, especially in the earlier years of sanctions, right? Sort of like, so countries that are economically weak might be more vulnerable to this type of sanctions. The other thing, of course, is that it depends on how much countries can themselves evade sanctions, right? One of the biggest problems in implementing sanctions is the sanctions busting, right? Even in the case of Russia, right? Russia still continues to sell its natural resources to countries like China and India, right? To be able to evade or mitigate the cost of sanctions. In countries, when sanctioned countries find ways to deny this third-party sanctions busters, those countries will also be the ones that will be more vulnerable to pressure, and they might be more responsive to external demands for reform. Behnam, I hope I answered your question, but this is, I think, what I could think of.
Thank you. The next question is from Hashim Pesaran. So it's a more technical question. So he's asking, do your results depend on the nature of the sanctions, their duration, and their circumstances under which the sanctions are removed? Or presume you do not include countries that have been subject to sanctions over the whole of your sample period? I presume you need switches for identification. So it's a question of type of sanction, nature of sanction that you have studied, the duration, and whether the results depends on these factors.
Yes, thanks for the question, Hashim. I think, yeah, this is a great one. We were to keep the model simple for now. Again, this is just work in progress. We only looked at our key distinction is human rights versus non-human rights sanctions, right? We are most interested in human rights sanctions. I think that's what is the most related to what we are doing. We also, one of our key conditions is the outcome of sanctions, right? we could probably, per your suggestion, we could probably look at sort of like the cost of extensiveness of those sanctions, right? Hashim, that will be a good one. We didn't look at the duration because we are looking at post-sanctions period, right? We are not interested in the sanctions, the length of ongoing sanctions. But we do sort of looked at what happens once sanctions are lifted. At least we find some substantially significant effect of sanctions, lasting effects of sanctions, up to 10, 12 years, right, following the removal. But again, sort of then also like in terms of like circumstances under which the sanctions are removed, there could be some factors. If there was like a political regime change or a leadership change in target governments, these are some of the other additional sort of factors that may condition the effect, right? To be fair, given it's like a working paper, this is like this is an excellent question that we will consider some of these additional traits or features of sanctions that may actually drive the results. But for now, I think what we have is the core of what we want to argue, right? It is conditioned by the outcome of sanctions. We want to make the case that even standard countries declare that our sanctions worked. These leaders no longer repress their people. Our suggestion is not so fast. If we look at the post-sanctions period, some of those leaders might not be sincere reformers. They might have this insincere commitment to human rights, and hence they may go back to their regular bad behavior.
Thank you. I have one more question because we were talking about long-term impacts of lifting of human rights sanctions on the human rights outcomes. I was interested to find out how you distinguish the short-term and the long-term effects of removal of human rights sanction in your modeling approach.
Yeah, this is an ECM. Like you basically calculate the long run multiplier, Mohammed. It's sort of like the difference ones are on and off, right? 0, 1. That gives you the immediate impact. But based on the change variable and your sort of lag DV, you can calculate the long run multiplier to see how the effect may continue over time. So, right, we see the impact is likely to exist in the case of the successful cases, but it will decline as the years progress, which is to say that the effect is stronger in the earlier rather than later years.
Right. So here in this slide, we see that 10 years after lifting of human rights sanctions, still, I mean, the effect is negative, right? Up to
negative, but considerably lower, right? The impact, human rights sanctions itself may not drive that poor behavior, right? So the realistically, right? I think it's more realistic to see the impact of the sanctions relief, and when the leaders have the sanctions relief, if they will really go back to sort of their regular repressive behavior, they are likely to do in the earlier years, right? The impact may continue. Of course, this is just a statistical sort of estimate, but I think it just tells us at least that the impact may be lasting enough. I assume it's not realistic to assume this effect will last like 15, 20 years, right? Because there's some other factors that will affect.
I mean, the previous slide, which was showing the year, it seems that imposition and lifting of sanction at the end doesn't make much difference for human rights, right? So in both cases are negative.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the imposition part especially makes sense, right? That's where if they will not respond, this is why also one of my main findings, I've written 2 different papers, right, that shows that the imposition should be the driving factor, right? But what is interesting is that, like you said, that substantive effect may even last after human rights. Essentially.
Yeah. I mean, in both cases are negative effects on the human rights, right? So in that sense, the sanctions are not improving human rights conditions in a country, and lifting of them equally thing.
Yeah.
So I was also thinking if the effects of sanction or lifting of sanction, the human rights outcome depends on other socio-demographic economic factors in a society. Again, back to example of Iran. I assume Iran has a young population, so the demographic factors, which is very much connected digitally worldwide, so they are aware of social rights, political rights, human rights in other countries, in European and the other countries maybe. And they're also highly educated, urbanized population. I guess if the sanctions are lifted in case of Iran, so we are observing a more powerful middle class and higher welfare,
Sure.
which makes this engagement political process more, they would be more engaged in the political decision making. And I guess if you look at, because right now there is no conditionalities in your modeling approach. So I
Yes.
guess that the local
Yeah.
condition might very much important to determine what will
Yeah.
happen on the human rights at the end of the day.
Yes. We do have control variables like wealth, democracy and others. Like it's a multivariate analysis. Like I haven't shown that because I didn't want table to be too crowded. But yeah, I think sort of like we haven't really thought about it, but right, you are suggesting that some of this effect may be moderated by some factors like the size of middle class, the
Yes,
strength
I
of
mean,
civil society.
lifting of sanction in case of Syria, now we see is a very good example, right? So
Okay.
the Trump has lifted the sanction after regime change in the Syria. But the Syrian society is, civil society is very much damaged due to the war, long years of the war, civil war. Many of them are migrated outside of the Syria. So the question how the country can benefit, can use from these lifting of sanctions compared to a scenario like in Iran, which is still, I mean, the human capital, human resources are there, and the potential for grabbing this opportunity of lithium sanctions is much more larger than, to my opinion, in the case of Syria. So you might see that the lifting of sanctions in the case of Syria does not change very much as a hypothesis, of course, the situation. But in the case of Iran, given the available resources in Iran and the potential which has been constrained due to sanction, these can be basically reactivated and we would see better. So by conditionality, I mean this. I mean, it's, here you find out that without this conditionality, lifting of sanction does not bring anything positive to the human rights, but I suggest that these effect might be a different effect, might become even positive if that local condition, local situations make it possible to benefit from this opportunity following the lifting of sanction. That was my
Yeah,
point.
yeah, yeah. Those are the points. I think a lot of sort of not a lot of, but so there could be some sort of conditional, like multiplicative effects of sanctions through some of those socioeconomic and political factors.
Mm.
But I would argue that I don't think that it is realistic to assume, Mohammed, that once sanctions are lifted, the middle class go back to where it was, right? It will take time, right? I mean, the sanctions relief clearly help because of all these humanitarian effects, right? Those humanitarian effects will be declined, but assuming that those groups will somehow recover all of their status like prior to sanctions, it just doesn't seem to be like likely, at least in the very few right after the lifting of sanctions.
It takes time, yes.
It may take time. That's why that could be a good window of opportunity for repressive leaders. That taking time period, right? With they can use the lifting of sanctions as a shield to go after with the expectation that the middle classes will have a comeback, these groups will recover and mobilize, right? So yeah, I mean, this is where I think, and you ask and another someone else asking the audience that this is where I think we will sort of like make a case about how this mechanism work using specific cases in the hopefully
Right.
next edition of this paper.
Well, we have still 5 minutes time. So if there is any other question from audience, please feel free to ask it. Otherwise, I was also interested to ask you what would be the policy implication of your results for the sender of the sanction, for those who are exposing sanction in other countries. So your results shows that doesn't matter much either they impose the sanction or leave the sanction, the human rights condition seems to be worsening. So what would be your policy recommendations?
I think sort of like I think the policy of the implication is very obvious, and but at the same time not very easy to implement. Is that once you, I mean, again, human rights. My findings, my research, and others show that sanctions in general are detrimental to human rights. But even in the successful cases, right, there are some countries naturally given to pressure, and then they improve their human rights conditions. The key policy sort of suggestion here is that make sure that you have a mechanism to monitor what happens after those cases are lifted, right? We are already struggling with implementing existing sanctions because of all this sanction busting and others. But I can't think of any specific mechanism that sanctioning countries like the United Nations, sanctioning entities like the United Nations, European Union have in terms of monitoring post-sanctions period, right? Create new mechanisms, create new regimes, institutions to make sure that, right, those targeted governments actually stick with their, like keep their promises and do not go back to what they usually do, right? That will be one of the things. Once again, sort of like I can't think of any specific study, right? Which will be an interesting area of research. Those of you are in the audience too, right? Like we need to also discuss like what do we do after sanctions are lifted, right? Like, do we have any? Can you think of a mechanism? I mean, maybe in the case of Iran, it could be the atomic agency may sort of monitor the nuclear proliferation. But in most other cases, what is it like standard countries do to monitor and sort of keep those target leaders in accountable, right?
So you recommend monitoring and accountability even after sanctions are lifted, at least with respect to human rights protection, right? A very final question to me from me, it was not very clear when you were talking about your data, what exactly, how the human rights protection are defined and what is the range of these scores?
Okay, so yeah, this is a data that looks at all four major rights of political repression: freedom from torture, freedom from extrajudicial killing, respect for civil liberties. It is coming from the WEDAN varieties of democracy data set. They have this respect for human rights variable. That's what we have. It just only looks at the extent of political repression in countries.
So these are based on survey questions or expert opinions or perceptions?
Expert opinions, yes. No, it's not. It's a simple, each country gets a score per year. It's a country year level data.
So it's not based on object de facto, basically, what is happening on the ground. So
yes,
it's basically
no, that's not. That's not at the individual level. Data is at the state level, coded by experts. They on a numerical, on a 100 point, what happens?
So maybe one interesting test would be to check whether the results remains if you switch to the more objective ways of human rights protection in these countries, right? So excellent. So we come to the end of our today webinar. That was the presentation, the sanction human rights, and we learned that the imposition and lifting of sanctions seems not very much helpful, and the recommendation of Dr. Persson what Peksen was that monitoring after lifting of sanctions is still important, and the accountability mechanism is still important, suggested recommendation after lifting of sanctions. So with this, I would like to thank you, Dr. Peksen, for your very informative and interesting presentations on this very important timely topic. We will continue discussing the sanction, the forthcoming webinars, and our next meeting would be in October. We have usually the second Wednesday of each month, we have IIEA webinar, and we would come with more information regarding the topic of our next webinar in October that I hope to see you all again there. So with this, Dursun, we conclude.
Yes, thank you again for inviting me. Thank you all for joining us today. And it was a pleasure to present my work in progress. Thank you. Thanks for all
Thank
of
you
you.
very much. Bye-bye.